Hello, and welcome to the Rapise Advanced Web UI Testing Techniques webinar. My name's Adam Sandman from Inflectra, and I'm going to be talking about how to test a complex web application using the Rapise automated testing tool. So what we'll be talking about today is, first of all, looking at the different ways we can record web objects and using XPath and CSS to try and locate objects in a web application. And we'll be looking specifically at complex objects, particularly data grids, where you have dynamic data that can be sorted in different ways and where you want to be able to locate objects on the page reliably, even if the page is sorted differently or things in the data change, you add new items to the grid, and you still want the test to work correctly. In part of that, we'll be using different XPath strategies, looking at how to use IDs, text values, positions, which we call ordinals or indexes, using accessibility attributes called ARIA, which is used by some modern applications to make things more testable. And then we're also going to look at an example of using a custom library built on top of the core web objects for testing jQuery UI widgets. This webinar was recorded during a live session, and there are some questions and answers at the end of the session. So by now you'll probably have used Rapise to do a simple test where you can log into the application and basically click through and record events. And if not, we can do another session on that. So I'm just going to log in first ahead of time. Oops. Like that. And so one of the first things we'll be talking about is dealing with a data grid like this. So when we use Rapise and we start to record, one of the challenges we're going to run into with a data grid is that we want to be able to make the test robust and not what's called flaky, meaning that if we change the data in the grid or we sort it or do anything to it, it isn't going to break our test. We also want to make sure that when we're retrieving information, we're retrieving the information we expect. So before we get into the code side, the first thing is this is a list of books, and we can go in here and we can create a new book. So new book 1, and that puts at the bottom. So if I record a test and I use the built-in verify feature, which I'm going to do in a second, it's going to basically record a test for the last row, actually for the 15th row. If I add another book, it'll become the 16th row. But my test will still be looking at row 15. So the question is, how do we deal with situations like that? Or if we want to edit a book, but we don't want to edit it based on its position, row number 5, we want to make sure it's the book with a certain ID or a certain name. So how do we go about doing that? And there's a couple of different ways you can do these things, and we'll talk about some of the options. So the first thing will be, let's try and do it the sort of simple way, which would be just to record and see what happens. So I'm going to go in here, create a new test. I'll be using JavaScript rather than RVL, but if you'd like me to use RVL, I'm happy to do that as well. So I just choose Web, Chrome, and I use JavaScript. So what I could do is just use the recorder. And I could, for example, I could click on this edit link right here, which will record an event. And the other thing I might do, I'll just pause the recorder a second so I can go back without recording the click, is I might want to verify this new book. So let's go ahead and verify the new book. Control and 1. Text. New book 1. So that looks very good. It meets my need. I can click on a link and I can enter the book. So let's see. What Rapise has done, if you go down here into the tree, is it's recorded the click on the edit and it's recorded the condition. But if we go into the actual object tree and we actually look at the edit link, it's a little small, so I'll make it a bit bigger. We can actually go in here, and depending on which version of Rapise you have, we've added a little ... box. You can actually bring it up into a full screen now. This is a new feature we added recently. And you can see what we've actually learned is that we're going to find a web form with an ID. We're looking in some divs. That's okay, that doesn't change. A table, and the table's got an ID value. Okay, that's good. That's going to be the same whether we change the order of the books or anything. But then the next part is problematic because we're basically looking for row 10, cell 5, the first hyperlink, which does actually meet the criteria. except that if we were to now want to find a different book, we'd have to record a different link. Worse, if I was to insert a book in a different order or resort this grid, then I could quite well break that test. So instead of clicking on this book, I might be clicking on another book, which will be bad. And if we look at the verification, it's the same thing. We can go here and see what it recorded, and we'll see exactly the same situation. It's recorded these divs and the table ID, which is fine, but then it's the 16th row in the second cell. So it's going to compare that. So if we change things on the grid, or we want to verify a different book, we've created a very flaky test. It's very sensitive to the ordering and the positioning of the cells in that table. So what we want to do is see different techniques for making our test more intelligent and robust. So how do we go about doing that? Well, what we can do is when we hit record, let's make sure on the screen, yeah, hit record. Okay, we want to use the spy tool. So the spy tool will let us interrogate the page. And there's a nice little trick here where you can click on this transparent option. This makes this recorder transparent, so you can still click on things and see things, but it's still down there recording the activity. And then what I want to do is use the highlighting mode and the track to find the right item. So let's go to Control T and let's find our new book. Let's start with this one, Control T. Okay, so this is our book. And it's basically a cell called New Book, and it's in a row, in a table body, in a table, in a div, and some other stuff. And you'll see down here we have some different selectors that we based on mostly on XPath. One is also on CSS. And so what will happen is if I double click on it, it's going to give us what we would say is the suggested locator. And that's going to say, well, to find that cell, I can get the body of the table, and I can get row 16 and cell 2. And that could be useful, but unfortunately, as we said, if we change the order of data in this grid, that's not going to work so well. So another possibility would be I could use the XPath text, which is this one here, and there's an option to actually change which one this tool uses as a default, or you can just cut and paste in the different options. We can test it to make sure it's actually going to work. As you can see here, it found it quite nicely. And that would actually be a good one if we wanted to select a book and guarantee the name wasn't going to change. Now, in most cases, book names could be sensitive to white space. We do some normalization of the space, so that helps a little bit. But actually, let's say the book ID 15, is what we really want to find. We want to get this book by its ID number because we know that's always going to be right. So let's put that in instead, and let's get that. And so what we can do here, we'll test it. That gets us this cell here. And now we can use our knowledge of the web page to do a little bit of extra work and simply say find its parent, and instead of getting that cell, get the cell next to it. We test that, and now we've got the right book. So that's actually going to create a new object if I hit learn, a synthetic object effectively that points to new book 1 by its ID value. So if you've got a situation where you are not reliably selecting things, using this spy tool lets you have some control over how is Rapise going to learn the object. What is it pointing to? Now obviously you could have manually typed the XPath in that previous screen on the object tree, so you can certainly do that too, but this gives you a visual tool to actually look at the application and test it, because in some cases this may not be a good test. For example, one thing I don't like already about this is the fact that we're relying on it finding a cell with this number. If there was a second table in this page, it's actually not going to work so well because it's actually going to find that cell in the multiple tables. So we might want to actually add a check for the right table ID, which is right here. So it helps you actually look at what you're using and make sure that what's being recorded is actually going to be robust and not just simply a throwaway test. So what I could do here is go back onto this right here, double click on that, and then I can just append like this. And if I learn that, test that, sorry, that's good, but that's a much more robust test. Now it's guaranteeing I've got the right table, and only the right table. It's also guaranteeing I'm getting the right ID, and it's getting the right cell. So I like that, so I'm going to hit learn. And that becomes a new learned object. And if I hit finish, go back into Rapise, there is in fact a new object right here, that one there. because I had the other one with the same name, it's just created a slightly different name. So in real life, you'd probably want to remove this one and rename this. So that's an example where you're going to basically use the tools inside Rapise to actually customize the XPath that's being learned. Now, if I do record again, we're not just limited to XPath, we can do CSS. So if you're used to things like jQuery and jQuery selectors, you can also do it with CSS. So I'll do the same thing. This time we'll try and find the edit button. And we want to edit this book, Amsterdam. So we're going to go in and we're going to do track, Control T, make this transparent so it doesn't get in the way, and bring this over here. And we've now got our href and our link. Now the link is, if you double click on it, it's actually a hyperlink with an href and an ID. And in fact, that's actually quite a good locator because that ID is in the URL and that will only match that link. It's not position based. So in this case, it actually has found automatically a pretty good locator. So I would be quite happy to use that in a test. The other thing it might be worth doing would be to add the name of the book. Sorry, the name of the table, just in case we have multiple tables with the same hyperlink in the same URL. Or we might have a static link on the page somewhere else that has the exact same hyperlink, which probably isn't what we want. So what I would do is double click on this, learn that, and then just add that in right here. And just test. That's good. Hit learn. So that's using XPath again. Now to use CSS, it's very similar. It does suggest CSS. CSS is a bit more tricky of a language, so the Rapise automatically generated ones tend to be a bit complicated, so usually you're better off writing it yourself. But you could do something like table.main. No, sorry, it's not. I want the class is data grid, so it will be table.datagrid, like that. Test CSS. There's my table. And I want to get a cell, and I want to get a cell, let's have a look, where this content is Amsterdam. I'm not sure if you can do that with CSS, so CSS is not as flexible, so let's say we want to get the first one. And it will try and test, and if it doesn't work, it will let you know that it's trying to find it. Oh, it did find it there. Okay. Oh, no, query is invalid. So if you're not so familiar with CSS, you want to look at it first and bone up on it. Otherwise, if I just put that, it's going to find all the table cells. And so CSS is particularly good when you have a lot of strong classing and styling that you can lock onto. And so in this case, it's not so useful with the grid. The XPath, I think, is better. But if you were looking for something that was based on styles, like, for example, div, the page, and you wanted to find the header, like that, that's a good use of CSS. But it really is up to you. You can do most things with both. CSS tends to be more complex for certain queries and simpler for others, but it gives you the choice. And when you've got something you like, that's the header row, you could learn that, and now you've got a header row, which is right here. And you can see the class structure right here in the web spy, which makes it easier to find things. And if I hit finish, you've now got in here a div, which is the header. And the word div is a bit meaningless, so let's give it a better name. So we'll go in here and we'll change it from div to header. And that just renames the friendly name. So that's what you're going to use. If we wanted to click on the header, you can drag it here and do click, like that. That will click on the header, which won't do very much because it's not clickable, but you could. And if you want to click on the edit button, you can drag that, and you can see right here it's got our customized XPath. And we could take that and we click on that. So that's an example of doing some simple clicking on the two objects. Now, that makes sense when you've got a small number of objects and you want to learn them as a discrete entity. So that's a good way to find the header. It's a good way to find the table. The one difficulty would be is if I wanted to click on 6 different books, that's a lot of learning of objects. I have to basically learn, in this case, 15 different edit buttons or 15 different verifies. That's probably not the most efficient thing to do. So it will be good for the header, it'll be good for learning something that you need one of. If you're going to do a query of any book, there are some other ways of doing it which are a bit more efficient in terms of using the system. And so what we would recommend is dynamic querying relative to a fixed object. So what that means is I want to basically find parts of the screen that are not going to change, and I only need one of, like this table. And then when I want to do a query of any item in that table, I'm going to make them write a query relative to that table. So I'm going to learn the table, because that's something that I don't want to have to keep finding every time in code, but I want to find a book dynamically so I can loop through and call with different IDs, things like that. We're very handy. So the way to do that is to do two things. First, we're going to learn the root object. So we'll do record, and we'll go to spy. And once we go to spy, I'm going to track, and I'm going to find the table. Sometimes it's hard to find the actual table. That's why the spy is handy, because you can then navigate up the tree structure. There's our table. Hit learn, hit finish, and I've now got a handle to the table. So that's good, and it's called main contact books. It's got a good name. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to drag this over. And now what I can do is do the query relative, and there's lots of different query options you can see here. You can get the children in a loop, you can get the count of children, this is the direct children, you can find a parent with an attribute, get attributes of it, get child attributes, get a sibling, get a parent. And then the two that I find the most useful in most cases are these two query. And you've got the option again of CSS or XPath. And that will query relative to that table, that grid of books. So let's use this one. So I'm going to comment these out because I'm not going to use these right now. Yep, question please.
Is that do query or down query? Is that just a Rapise JavaScript library you're calling there?
It's part of all the web objects. So in Rapise, when you're doing the question is, where does that function come from? Basically, Rapise has different object types, and all of the HTML objects inherit from a base HTML object class, and all of the objects that you learn in a web page do have this object. It is specific to Rapise, but it is available on any object that's a web page. If you're doing a desktop application, for example, you're obviously not going to see that. You may see something slightly different, which would allow you to query in a slightly different way. But any of these do-DOM objects, those are specific to web, and any of the web things you learn on a page will have that option. Query it by CSS or XPath, but it is specific to Rapise.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. And so what I want to do is, and again, I could be lazy and I can use the spy tool. So I go back into spy because I don't remember. Oh, sorry, wrong spy. That's a desktop spy. I need the web spy. Let's do that again. And I want to find so even though I'm not going to actually learn the object, I can still use the spy tool to do a little bit of my heavy lifting for me. So I'll track, and I want to find, let's say, this book, which we already found once before. We'll find it again. And I want to go in here, and I want to basically do //td / actually, let me just let it do the work for me, which would be here. Double click on that, choose this, put that in there, and that gets to the 15. I want the parent, and then I want the name. So I want the next cell, which is cell 2. Just test that. Oops, get rid of that piece there, and hit test. That's good. So let me grab all that, cancel. I just put in the clipboard, and I'm going to go back to my test and put it right here. So that says, get me the cell with the number 15 inside the root object, which is the grid. And it does return back an array. So match, I'll put matches equals that. And what I would do is put a little breakpoint right here. And I'm going to use my debugger just so I can check the data matches. Hit run with internal, and I'm going to hit play. Oh, I forgot. Sorry, I'd recorded something before. So let me comment all that out. It's gone to the other page. So the lesson there is don't make sure you read what you've actually recorded. So let me stop and do that again because I don't want to do those first steps. So let me go back. Okay, and do play. That's better. Matches is undefined, so I do, and just to recap, these are the debugging tools. So I'm going to use step over, which is F10. if you forget. And if I do F10, steps over one line, comes back, and there matches. Let's come back with something. So let's look in the variables. Matches is, what is it? It is an array, a length 1, and it's got some stuff in it. And the name, and it gives you, it's basically returning back a Rapise object which has various properties. You can see them all here. The name is the one we'd actually want to use, but it does give you some other stuff too. So you could do some other checking as well, the XPath. But the simple thing is you should check the name. So that looks like it picked it correctly, which is good. So I'm going to stop my debugger, and I'm going to go back. I'll run it without. And what I want to do is basically do tester.message, and I want to return matches 0.getText. And the gets and sets are the same things you would get on a standard object. So it's the same as the ones you would see on any other object. So it's any of these. So it's actually get no text. Okay, so that would work, or hopefully will work. Let's try it. Let's see what we get. Perfect. And that's nice, but not as nice as it could be. What we really want to do is make that into something reusable. So what we'll do is we'll click on this, and we're going to extract it into scenario. And this is a nice little feature that basically makes a function. So we'll call it getBookById. Okay, and there we've got a nice little function. And we want to return the name. So what we'll do is return, and actually if we go back here, I should have probably captured that bit too. I want this bit in the inner part. Put that in here. That's going to return me back the name of the book. Now obviously the ID is hard-coded, so we do want to put that in here and change that to ID. So that's pretty good. And we can now call the function. So if we go back to our main test, we'll get this function, and we're going to stick this right inside here. So we'll get book 15. And for good measure, just to make sure that we get some value out of the function, we'll get book 6 as well. And obviously we could loop through a spreadsheet and get a whole bunch of different books. And so hit play. Hopefully this will work. And if it does, we'll get 2 books out of it for the price of 1. And there we go. Chesil Beach and new book 1. So that's good. So we've now got a nice little function that we can use, and we didn't have to do a lot of work. All we did is we learnt the parent object, which was the table, and then we did a slight subquery on that. And the benefit of this is I don't have to learn 15 different edit buttons or 15 different book names. I've got a simple function that uses the learned object and does a dynamic query. And the benefits are that should we rename the book, say the table, say we change this table, or we change something else about it, we don't have to actually rewrite our function. We would just relearn this root object, the grid, and then the query itself under that is in the code. So it separates out the things that won't change from the things that will change, or you want to be dynamic. So you get the best of both worlds. Before I move on, any questions? Yeah. So XPath and CSS is the most general case because that lets you query by anything. Because XPath as a language has an equals and a not equals, and various other language constructs. So I would say XPath is the more powerful of the two in that regard. CSS will match things. It doesn't do so well at not matching things in general. XPath, you've got an equals operator and a not equals operator, so you can do things that are more powerful where you can say find anything that hasn't got something. So XPath will give you all the flexibility you need to do that. And then there are some simpler commands if you wanted to. When you don't want to use XPath, you do have the option, hold on, for things like getting a child, getting the count of children, You can find the attributes, so just getting one attribute, getting all the attributes. So there are some helper functions that avoid you having to use XPath for some simple cases. But to be honest, the most powerful is the XPath and then probably CSS, because you can do things like finding it by name or by not equals. And in fact, one of the nice features would be, obviously, it's easy to write XPath, it's harder to test it. So one of the things that's nice is if you use the spy tool, I go back here, I can go in here and try things out in real time. So I can go in here and say, okay, let me see if I can find what I'm after. So let's go in and let's, first of all, let's find the book itself, the table itself, I should say. So we'll go in here and track the table. And let's say we want to find something. I'll just learn that first. So here we go. So everything's relative to that now. And what we want to do is find a table cell where maybe the text is, I forget the syntax. I think it's this. It might be the greater than equal to, but that's okay. Text is not equal to new book 1, stuff like that. And so there you go. So find all the ones that aren't that. So you can use the power of XPath to do a not query like that. And again, anything that you can do in XPath, you can do here. I've only scratched the surface. You can do parents, you can do siblings, you can do lots of different options. XPath is the most flexible. So that would be my recommendation for things like that. Does that answer the question? And again, these tools are very powerful. You can use it for testing CSS and XPath before you actually write anything. It interactively will test it. And you can use the spy in different browsers. In theory, the XPath should be the same in all browsers, but in case it isn't, or if the web page renders differently in different browsers, like we have seen some situations where the web page is making some hints based on the browser user path. It sniffs the browser, and i.e. it renders a different control, for example. In which case you might need to use different spy tools for the different browsers. That's less common these days with modern applications, but in the past we did see that where the application itself literally rendered different HTML depending on the browser, and the test would fail, and it wasn't clear if it was the test that was wrong or the app that was wrong, and in fact it was the test. Any other questions so far?
Yeah, one question. How do we use regular expressions here?
Regular expressions. So I don't believe you can use regular expressions in this. In XPath, it's using CSS or XPath. Regular expressions we can use in some of the Windows libraries if we're using it to match the name of the control. So we do support regular expressions in Windows testing where we don't have XPath available. But for HTML applications, because we're using XPath or CSS, you can't use regular expressions inside of it. But I believe there are wildcards. So let me check XPath. Let's see what we got. XPath reference. Yeah, I don't trust Microsoft. But there are lots of different options. So I think there's some wildcard expressions. Yeah, so here you go. So you've got some wildcards here. So you do have access to wildcards. You just don't have access to regular expressions. For regular expressions, we can do that in a Windows test where you're looking at names of controls, but not in a web page. So we do have wildcards, but not regular expressions.
Okay.
Any other questions? You're welcome.
I do have one more question.
Okay.
We're currently recording using the SES object.
Yeah.
Is there a way knowing the XPath we can create a blank new object from scratch?
Oh, sure. Let me stop what I'm doing and let's show you that. Yes, there is a way to do that. So the question is, we don't want to use the learning function to learn the objects. We want to basically dynamically query the object in code. Now, I would probably say, in general, we would recommend, if possible, using the recorder to at least learn some of the root objects, just because it makes the test less, less code heavy and easier to maintain. So it's sort of the general recommendation is that you obviously don't want to learn every single, mouse click or every single edit button or every single hyperlink, every single button on the page. That quickly gets unmanageable. But certainly we would say you might want to consider at least learning the header, the main navigation area, things that don't change and contain other controls. That way you have at least an object tree, and then you can do the subquerying, which is a bit like what you're saying. If you don't want to do that at all, and you want to literally write it in code without any root object, you can do that also. To do that, if I go back to my main test, you use the navigator object, and we have a do find by XPath, sorry, DOM find by XPath, like that. So what we could do, and I'm going to go in and basically comment out this and comment out that, so I'm not up there, so we can try this out. So basically, that's our XPath, and I can basically take the same XPath we have already, and I can just try it out without the learned object. So the simplest thing to do is to go into my root object, which I have here. I'll just click on the triple dots. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to put that in here, like that. And then I'm going to basically take the second part, which is in my dynamic code, which is right here, and I'm going to put that together with it, like that. And I've got one too many slashes. So what that's doing is it's saying, don't need I'm not using objects. I just want to find, based on the XPath, what does it look like? And obviously the ID has to be defined. So I'll just put that in as 15. And that's very similar. You can still use the spy tool to actually generate the XPath, but instead of learning it, you're simply doing it in code. And that will return back, if I remember correctly, a list of matches. So like that. And we can do the same thing we did before. We can stick a breakpoint on it, and we can run it with debugger, and we can make sure the browser is running. Yep, and we can hit play. And we'll step over. And what did it find? It found matches, and it found, let's have a look, new book 1, so that looks pretty good. So I think it found the same thing, so that's good. Stop my debugger, and if I go back to my code, I can basically just use the same thing I did before, which is in here, and use that. Yep. Hit play, and it should just return back new book 1. Oh, hold on a minute. That did not work. Why did it not work? Oh, 0 is not an object. Matches equal. Let me read the documentation. Maybe it's not an array. Maybe it's just 1. Hold on. Oh, wait a sec. I'm in the wrong section of my test. I was over here. So matches equals blah blah blah. Matches dot no text. That should work. So you know what? Let's just try it with the debugger one more time. And with the debugger, yep, let's do that. Okay, variables, matches. Oh yeah, it's not an array. It matches. Unlike the other one, it doesn't match a single. It matches. It's just one object. It's not an array. So that's my mistake. So simple enough to fix. Go in here, stop the debugger, go back here, and just get rid of that. And it should work this time. There you go, new book 1. So that's an example of just doing it directly in code. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome. But as I just said, I would caution, if you use this all the time, you end up with a lot of code. One of the benefits of the object approach is you get a more visual representation of what you have. But you certainly can use it, and you certainly can use it in conjunction with the other approach as well. So that's basically looking at XPath, CSS, complex objects, and a data grid. Now, the other thing we do have are some strategies around the different options. And we have some articles on our website which go through why you might use one XPath versus another. But we do have some pre-built ones, as I mentioned, that Rapise will record. So I'll just show you some of the ones we have, because I glossed over it a little bit when I was doing the spy tool. So let me just hit spy again. And it should hit the Chrome. Yep, there we go. And actually, let me not do that. Let me move it over here. Make that transparent. Track. Fine. And what it will give you, by default, it gives you the standard XPath, which will be whichever you've chosen in the options, and I'll show you that in a second. And then the other ones it will give you, it depends on what the application supports. It does what's called ARIA. Now, ARIA is something where if you've got accessibility attributes in place, and these are specific new attributes that they have, which help make web applications accessible to the blind, but it also helps them testable. They're attributes that don't actually affect the display, like role and various other things, and they can actually make it easier to test because they help explain the page. I can show you some of those in a minute. If the application doesn't have that, it doesn't really help you much. Now, full gives you the fully expanded set of all the objects in the tree. So it'll go from the top of the tree and it goes down the tree all the way to where you've selected with all the index positions. Now that's good in some cases if you really want to make sure you're getting the right object, and maybe there's lots of tables which have all got different parents and none of them have got any IDs on them, and it may be the only option. If that's the case, the danger with that will be is if you change your page layout, it's obviously going to break. So if you move this form that we have, it's a .NET form, if we move that inside the div, or we change this div and put it outside the form, you're going to quickly break the application. So it's good when you know the application is never changing and there are not any other options. There's no IDs on things, there's no attributes on things. It's a very static application that isn't going to change. You could potentially use that. Otherwise, you've got the indexer option, which just literally applies the index as little as possible to the element you've selected. And then we also then have the minimum and standard options, and they'll use the minimum path to get to the object. So they'll avoid extraneous controls and try and get you the simplest path. And obviously, this particular item doesn't have an ID, so if I chose one that did have an ID, some of these values will change. So that will actually basically find you the table based on the ID because it knows that's a good option, whereas the full would have given you the part of the table using all of the parents. And the other is the index, gives you the index position. Then the other option we do have is text. Text is an interesting one because in some cases it's a good idea, in other cases not so much. So I used it earlier on because I wanted to quickly find the right book, and so it helped me find the ID value because I knew that 3 was stable. I knew it's the primary key, it's the ID of the book. It's a great point just to build off my query. So this is a good one to use. If I was doing it by the name maybe or the date, it's not such a good option then because it will actually potentially not find it, and that would be a bad thing because that would actually be very sensitive to the book name changing. So that's when I would maybe not use that. Now, one of the things you can do in the options, so these are all different options you can use. You can change in the options which XPath will be the default. So this top one, XPath, it's using right now standard. That's why it's the same. You could decide that this application we're always better off using text, or it's a very well documented application with ARIA attributes. Let's use that. Whatever you know is going to be good, you have the option right here of using it as your default. Save you having to keep choosing all of them. And that's what will be used in the SPY. It's also what gets used in the recorder and during the learning. So that's where it even helps the recording piece too. So that's a good feature. Yeah, question?
Yeah. So there are certain scenarios where you have a web application
Yeah.
where the object changes based on different environments. So in environment 1, if the object XPath is let's say A, in environment B in environment 2 the object XPath may be B. So how do you handle such scenarios?
That's a great question. So if you've learned an object, obviously if it's possible to use some expression or wildcard where it's going to match them both and not match things that and not match other things, then obviously that's the best option. You could simply learn the object and there you go. If that doesn't work, another possibility in Rapise would be to use the same test script but to actually have a different object tree. You could actually learn all the objects differently and still use them in the same test case. So for example, if I hit cancel, that's one of the reasons why in Rapise we have these logical names like this. For example, the logical name of this is main content grid books. Well, I could actually change that. I don't need the main content. I could just make it grid of books like that. So I can use that in my test anywhere. So I can just drag that over here like this. Now there's a feature where you can use you can actually have what's called a subtest that shares the object tree, or you can have a subtest that doesn't share the object tree. And so what you could even do is have one set of objects like this object tree for environment 1, and have another set of objects for environment 2, but have the same test script. Because you're always using these logical names, then you're not tied to the physical XPath representation of the object. That obviously does not work if you're doing dynamic querying. That portion here is obviously going to be buried in your test script. You'd have to handle that. But the object definition portion would be independent of the environment you do, because it uses this logical name. And that's the other reason why if you did use the option to write it all in this form, you don't get that benefit. So there are kind of two options, I guess. One is to, if you can write the query or the XPath that's sufficiently generic for both cases, that's good. If not, then using two object trees with the same logical names, these friendly names that we have, but with different XPaths would solve the problem. Hey, you're welcome.
Let's say I get the value of an element in that first row.
Right.
The first cell in the first row.
Okay.
And the number is 1,000. And then separately, I want to query the database directly, look up that value in the table in SQL Server, and give me 1,000, and I'll compare it and say, oh, this has passes because what's in the database matches what's in the UI in the application. So the way I normally do that if I'm using Selenium or something is in code I would do a query to the database. But I guess there's a way to kind of like test data or whatever. But here I've got JavaScript in my stuff. So how am I going to query the database?
Oh, so the question is how is basically, and this is for the recording as well. Basically, if you have a database with a record of data, so for example, it looks just like this, but it's in the database. I want to compare that the book ID or the date on one of the books in the database matches the date or the ID or some other value that's in the page. Maybe they had a print flag, for example. So the question is how you do that. Now on the page, it's easy. You could learn the table, dynamically query the objects. I've done that already several times today in different ways. That's very easy. Now to get the data out of the database, there's two main options. One is to query the database using SQL. And Rapise has a database library to do that. The other option would be if there's an API, you could use the REST or SOAP option that I think I showed the last time to do that as well. For the database, though, that's definitely possible. You just go into database right here, and you can attach the database and do a query and actually get the data out. And I believe we do have an example on our website of this, so I'm just going to take a chance I can find it. That's always the problem. Let me go to our website. Rapise dynamic database query. Let's see. Oh, here we go. There we go. So this is the one. KB87 for those who are writing this down. Basically, this is where you can use the code here, and it's actually got an example of a SQL query, and we have a sample actually in the installation I can show you. And basically this will connect to a database. This is actually SQL Server. It's actually connecting to Spirotest, and we're getting a list of projects, and then we're basically getting the values, and then we're verifying the UI using a learned root table object, and the simple do query XPath to get the child rows. Does that make sense? So yeah, it's a very common situation, and so the two objects you typically want to use, if it's a database, the database option obviously, and if it is in a spreadsheet file format, sorry, you do have the option to use spreadsheet, which I presume you've seen, but you can attach to a spreadsheet and read the data in it as well, and you can actually create a spreadsheet directly in Rapise and open it. The other option we do have is if it's in a flat file, let's say it's a text file, you can also open a text file, maybe it's CSV or something that can't be read in Excel very easily, maybe it's tab separated. I guess that could be opened in Excel also, but you can also read flat files too. So you've got file, database, and Excel, and then obviously web services is the other option. You could query a REST call, get the data out, and verify it. Now there's one other thing I'd like to mention about libraries that is useful, and Rapise comes with different libraries. Depending on the application, we've got some pre-built extensions which handle different types of web framework, and that's sometimes really handy. And a more advanced topic is you can also write your own libraries. That's a more advanced topic than today. But you can actually write libraries where you can extend the Rapise to actually recognize new objects. Because ultimately, when you look at Rapise, you have these objects like a div or a grid or a hyperlink. Those are primitive web objects. They're part of the browser. But there's also cases where you have objects that are extensions to the browser. What I mean by that is it's a framework. Like, for example, we have an example here using jQuery, but jQuery is just an example. We also have examples for Salesforce and Dynamics, Microsoft Dynamics, which is a web app, and we can have done it for other libraries as well. And if you have a custom set of controls, you could even extend it to actually handle specific controls you've got that aren't maybe standard. So what will happen is you've got like this menu control, and you've got a progress bar, some tabs. You would really like it so that Rapise could treat this as a menu rather than as a series of divs that you have to click on. It means that you can actually make it easier for a tester. So as a programmer, you can write a extension to Rapise that recognizes the menu, and the tester who's running through a test could actually just use record and play, and it will record the menu correctly rather than just a bunch of clicks on the divs. So this is the example. What you would do is if you've got a web page, I'm just going to comment this other stuff out right now. And initially, if we were to do record, and I'm just going to choose something, I'm going to type in the date. It basically clicked on the 8, click on the date picker, hit finish. So what do we get? We got nothing very useful. We got basically a text box and a hyperlink. So those are primitive objects. One's a hyperlink, one's a text box. Or yeah, that's right. So that's useful, but it's a series of separate objects. We've got an 8, we've got a date picker. If we click on those tabs, we're going to get an object for each one of these tabs. However, if we go into libraries, and I should warn you, that selection box is actually new in this version of Rapise that's coming out next week. This is version 5.4. But basically, you can do it in the current version by just editing it in text. We go in here and we choose the additional libraries, and the ones marked DOM, they're browser extensions. So we choose jQuery UI on top of Chrome, and that's basically an extension that says I recognize specific web framework objects that live on top of the browser. And we've got similar ones for other libraries as well, including Dynamics and some other frameworks out there as well. So we do that. We choose select, and if you go back to Rapise, you'll notice we now have this extra library here. And in the current version of Rapise, you could just manually put that in yourself. We've added this selector in 5.4. Now, what that does is that tells Rapise that actually we can actually use that library to look at the objects, and it basically filters the XPath, and it will understand when it comes across something it recognizes and says, okay, that's an actual control, not just a series of web objects. So if I remove these two, and I do the exact same recording again, and I click on this and choose date, hit finish. If it works correctly, we get a date picker, and we don't even need that click. Get rid of that. We've basically got a date picker there. And so you can use, and that date picker we've written, and just an example, has a series of functions that go with it. And it's basically an extension of our standard HTML objects. And we have the same thing for the accordions and the tabs. If I go in and record, I can click on a tab. And you'll see when I hit the buttons, it's recording against the tab control. So what it's doing is... That's a good question. We've actually looked at Bootstrap. One of the problems with Bootstrap we've found is that the class names are not as standardized. They're very simple. We actually use Bootstrap for Spyro Team. They're very short. They're not very standardized. It's easy for different pages and different controls. So we actually haven't built one for Bootstrap yet. We're looking at ways to try and make this easy for people to make their own libraries first, because the problem is that Bootstrap, unlike some of these other libraries, it tends to have lots of different names like button, the group, button this, and so it's hard to uniquely identify things as easily, we found. So we were looking at it at one point, but it quickly became a difficult target. So we decided to focus on some applications like Dynamics and Salesforce, where there's a more standardized use of the controls, and then we're going to be providing tools to help people build their own libraries. Because Bootstrap is used in so many different ways, it's not always coded, in a standard way every time. That was one of the problems we found. So the long answer is yes, we will, but not as probably a shrink wrapped library, because there's so much variation in how it's used. You're welcome. And one of the things we are looking to do is put together, even in the short term, is actually a tutorial of how to write these libraries. They're not actually that hard to write. They're basically all in JavaScript, and they basically will examine the XPath, and they look for class names, and you can easily write your own libraries. So we're looking actually potentially in the short term writing a white paper to actually expose that functionality in terms of how to do it in code. And then what we're actually looking to do is add a GUI-based way of building a library. That's kind of the next more advanced thing to do. But the libraries we do have are jQuery. We do have them for some packaged apps like Salesforce and Dynamics. And we will be working on a white paper to explain how you could do it yourself using the JavaScript editor. And all the libraries, if you're curious, are installed in Rapise in the installation folder. You just go into where they are in Program Files. And if you go to Rapise, it's in under Engine and Libraries. They're all right here. So if I looked at jQuery, for example, you could even see how we've implemented it. So if you've got a jQuery that's maybe slightly non-standard, you could even just slightly tweak it. But they're all basically here. And all they do is they just simply recognize like the date picker. If I edit that, it's basically it looks for certain HTML, and it knows this is the date picker, this is the select date, this is the previous month, and then it basically implements that by calling the appropriate jQuery. It's basically a way to write a package that behind the scenes is just doing clicks, text entry, all the things you'd be doing in code, but instead of every tester having to do it, you write it once, you expose it as a property on a control, and now it's reusable for lots of other people. And that's basically the theory of it. Okay, so the question for those is that how do we do the mobile testing for the recording? And basically, we use the existing devices or simulators or cloud that you're using already. We basically use Appium as our gateway. So you would either have a local Appium server running on this machine, which is for Android. For iOS, it has to be a Mac, obviously hosting the device. So you need to have a Mac on the same network with a Appium server running, and we connect to Appium to do the mobile testing for those. Otherwise, it could be something like Source Labs, where you've got essentially a remote cloud-based Appium URL, and we just connect to that device cloud. So we basically use the Android simulator, the iOS simulator, Source Labs or equivalent, or a physical device on a USB port. All three options will work. But it's nothing Rapise is doing. It's basically the standard Appium options, really. Thanks for watching this session on Rapise Automated UI Advanced Testing Techniques. I hope this video was really helpful, and if you would be interested in more videos on automated testing or application lifecycle management, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you have any questions or ideas of other videos you'd like us to write, please write them in the comments. Thanks so much.